All right. Welcome back to the Hackers Notepads. My name is Cristian Servin, and I'm very happy to have you here in this new session of the podcast. Today, we have an exciting talk on robust learning with new geometric primitives. We have Dr. Joseph Anderson, aka Joe, he's a friend of mine from Salisbury University. So we're gonna go ahead and talk about very important aspects in, I guess, in these days, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and the whole impact of machine learning these days. So right now you have heard machine learning pretty much everywhere, not only in computer science. You can hear a couple of courses in mathematics. They talk about the applications. Of course, there's some theory behind the scenes of these applications that are completely robust and defined in mathematics. So most of this work is not just new work. It's something that has been going on for years, for decades, as a matter of fact. The fact that you see it more and more is because there's new technology that is being infused in this machine learning techniques, and because computers are getting super fast, now it makes a lot of sense to extract those techniques, those ideas, and put it in a device like a cell phone or a mobile device, your tablet, in a camera and whatnot. So there's a lot of applications right now on machine learning in artificial intelligence. Many people believe that there's a lot of science fiction behind the scenes, and there's a lot of things that are very true. And we're going to talk about a couple of those aspects in terms of geometric primitives. Before going to that aspect and before going to the entire idea of this podcast, let me just talk about Dr. Anderson, who we have it here. I have his impressive resume CV, right? His vita here in my other screen. And Dr. Anderson, he is from Salisbury University, Maryland, right? He got his computer science and engineering PhD on May 2019 from the Ohio State University. The thesis title was Geometric Methods for Robust Data Analysis in High Dimension. He also has a master's in science in computer science and engineering in December of 2015 from the Ohio State University with the similar thesis title, right? So he has also a bachelor's in science in computing and information sciences from St. Vincent College, May 2012. So his research interests are from theoretical computer science, machine learning, convex geometry, data science, statistics, optimization, probability theory, everything that actually relates with machine learning and AI. So probably his main interest there. He has received several awards, including the Salisbury Foundation's Faculty Research Grant, very outstanding one in 2018. Congratulations on that. Along many travel grants from big names, for example, Google and the Hansen Faculty Travel Award. He is the fellow from the Inspire CS Fellowships, a project funded by the National Science Foundation that runs in the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, in collaboration with Carnegie Mellon University. This is where I met Dr. Anderson, as a matter of fact, in this fellowship. We discussed a couple of the ideas. So the idea behind this fellowship is, this fellowship is to train machines, or in particular a machine learning component with several aspects in education, including equity gaps and misconceptions of learning. And I think it makes a lot of sense to have Dr. Anderson's involved in this particular fellowship, because the whole idea is when you have a lot of instructors and you have a lot of ideas, a lot of experiments, and at the end you feed it to a machine. Eventually the machine will learn, and then we'll basically make the best practice, per se. I'm not so sure if I'm very close to that, or at least I try to summarize what we're trying to do there. But of course, Dr. Anderson has been working with these ideas for years. So without any further ado, I gave you Professor Anderson here. Joe? How are you?
Thank you. Good. How are you?
Yeah.
Thanks for having me, and thank you everybody for coming today. So yeah, as Dr. Servin said, is that I'm from Salisbury University in the Department of Math and Computer Science, and I'm gonna kind of give you a crash course through machine learning, some topics in machine learning, not all of machine learning, and my small niche in the area. And hopefully it'll help carve out a little bit of a different perspective than what might possibly be the more common topics that you might see in the news or or on the internet. So yes, so the title of this talk is Robust Learning with New Geometric Primitives. So there are a couple different parts of this that I hope to unpack as we go. And the robustness and the geometric part kind of go hand in hand, but we're going to look at some techniques for machine learning that try to link statistics and geometry in a very intimate way. And they enable this idea of robustness, which is being somehow immune to very bad corruption. So part of my interest is thinking about how one can push the boundaries of what you might call a classical technique and somehow give it an extra defense against some sort of corruption or just pathological statistical behavior that does come up in nature. And hopefully I'll get a chance to mention a couple of those places where you can expect to find that. So, but to start at the beginning, of course, my friends and collaborators have had parts of all of this work that I'm going to talk about. So these go from Ohio State to UC Davis. Some of the one is at UCI now, Microsoft Research, and Google Research. And then currently, which is funny that I apparently have left off my CV, the recent version of my CV, is that I'm currently working on an NSF grant, the Computing Research Initiation Initiative grant through the NSF. So it's a 2-year, $175,000 grant that I have currently at Salisbury, 3 great students working with me, and then 1 past REU student working with me on continuing this research. So maybe keep a lookout for their names in upcoming publications. So of course, thank you to the NSF and Salisbury for funding a good portion of this. So just to give you a little bit of an idea of where I come from and how I get into this field is that I'm from near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So I've done a lot of fishing in my life, but that's not why I'm going to talk about fishing. Because as an undergraduate, as a sophomore, I started thinking about research and going to grad school. And that's somehow probably my advisor let me know about this type of program called an REU, a research experience for undergraduate. And so I applied and got into one at the University of New Orleans without really knowing what I was getting into. And we ended up working on this project that didn't look like machine learning at first, but it sort of evolved into it. And just as a nice little warm-up into what we know as supervised learning, I'll tell you a little bit about this project, but this is it was a very hands-on thing that, and I really believe that that's what gave me the foundational intuition for thinking about machine learning and putting myself in the right frame of mind for how to develop and think about machine learning processes. And so what this project was, it was funded by NOAA, the National Ocean and Aeronautical Association, something like that. So NOAA, and they have raw video of fish in a river, just swimming around. And they tasked my advisor, well, his funding was contingent upon him developing some software to process the video of fish and report back what type of fish is in each frame of the video, so that you can automatically tag which sort of fish are in which part of the river, what time of year, and get all kinds of data about migration and breeding and fish food supply and things like that, the harvest seasons. And so just some actual examples of the video we got are at the bottom of the slide here. And you can see some fish just kind of swimming around, and it's all grayscale. And you say, well, how do I write a program that's going to tell me what these fish are? So what this evolved into is that after doing some reading, we kind of figured, well, you got to get the fish out of the video. And so luckily we have the situation we're in is that there's this fixed aperture that's watching this part of the river at all times. And as long as you can assume that the river doesn't change too much, the only thing that changes has to be the fish. So we sort of reduced our task to say, okay, forget the fish for a second, or forget the identification for a second. Let's just find the fish in the video. Okay, so so this is a common idea in algorithmic design, as you've seen studying algorithms. If you've done your career, or if you're just beginning your career, you're going to study algorithms. And kind of the first step in any algorithmic task is, how can I translate this problem into something that will get me part of the way, but sounds easier? So our first task, we first tasked ourselves with just removing everything that wasn't fish. Okay, and what we ended up was writing some nice MATLAB software to read in the frames of this video and pull out the different fish using a technique called image clustering. And clustering is a type of machine learning that, well, I won't get to talk too much more about today, but it was kind of my first intro to allowing a computer to make a decision based on some computation that I don't really have control over anymore. Okay, so this was really where I started to write software that allowed computers to make choices without my intervention. And it was kind of neat. And so, but the foundations of this I had learned in math, in my math classes, my algorithm classes. We learned graph theory. And so we started using these graph theory based algorithms to connect edges, right? You have your frame of fish, which is full of pixels. And so what you end up doing is you represent each pixel as a node in a graph, and then all these nodes have edges between them. And you build weights onto these edges based on pixel color. So if we maybe look back one more and zoom in a little, you might connect very strongly this pixel and this pixel because they're basically the same color and they're nearby. But where you have borders or edges of things like this pixel and this pixel would probably not be colored very similarly because there's a harsh distance of just the color in the image. So this was sort of our starting point, is using image clustering to cut out parts of the graph based on the strength of their connections. And just to show you some of these results, these are the segmentations of the image sort of overlaid onto different frames. So we can see this is one particular algorithm, and it performs pretty well in some situations, but in other situations you can see it kind of suffers when the fish is at a strange angle or maybe even blurred. Well, it doesn't do too shabby right there, but even with a side view shot, it does not do too well. So this is just an example of our first step is just you got to understand what the state of the art is. You got to understand what other people have done. So we set out implementing all these different algorithms, and it was really interesting to see how such a small change in all these algorithms are using graph-based methods, and the only thing that's changing between these two algorithms is what value is computing the connections between pixels. Okay, so at least in these three image examples, this algorithm is not asserting a strong connection between this pixel and this pixel because they get put into different segments. However, this algorithm does a computation that's kind of smart enough to keep the whole fish connected, but at the same time, it's including this kind of ambiguous region as part of the fish. So this one's being a little optimistic, where this one is being a little pessimistic. And so having such a hands-on experience as an undergraduate really helped me think about, what, right, this is machine learning kind of at its finest. In its purest form is that you're asking the machine to extract some sort of real world information. And that in this example, you're asking the computer which pixels of this image are fish pixels, which are not fish pixels. So that's a really cool way to start thinking. I have some more examples just for the sake of comparison. You see that some of them a little more pessimistic than others, but most of them get the job done. So these graph-based methods that are very, I don't want to say primitive, but not overly complex for sure. They do a pretty good job. And so this gave us a really great head start into working through a pipeline of figuring out what it really means to go from raw, right, the raw data of video into some sort of pipeline of process the video into a usable data, which was the chunks that are fish. And so once we cut out the fish from these images, they get passed into, we used a pretty kind of an off-the-shelf neural network to pre-train on certain species and then feed the cutouts, only the cutouts, into the neural network. Because we tried the neural net without the cutouts and it was awful. It just didn't give us anything meaningful. So the moral of this was kind of two things: is that neural networks are amazing and the neural networks are awful. Meaning that there's a lot of trade-offs here. And we had to do a lot of work getting the data ready for the neural net, because we didn't have control over what's happening in the neural net. So we kind of have to prepare the data to be handled. But this was a really simple. Well, it took us 10 weeks to get this thing done, but in the end, it felt like a nice, clean pipeline of raw data into classification. So we could classify each chunk of pixels as each different species of fish. So this was the beginning of it all, and this got me thinking about, what can you prove about these algorithms? Can you prove that if your graph is correct enough, it will never connect these two pixels? Or can you prove that you'll never get these little extra bits? Or can you prove a maximum number of pixels you're ever going to get wrong, right? What are the foundations underneath this very kind of engineering type approach to the problem? Yeah. So after that, I obviously went to grad school at the Ohio State University, where my advisor was Luis Rademacher, who had kind of the opposite background I did. He did his PhD in math at MIT. So it was me and my programming, mostly programming, but some math background, and him. And that's data science in a nutshell right there, right? Applied math in a nutshell. You need a lot of math background put together with a lot of programming background. And together I got into this research on using geometry for what we'll call high dimensional machine learning. And I'll explain why we care about the high dimensional part in just a moment. So cool. Let me just make sure there are no questions. Cool. Yeah, feel free to, if there are questions that seem a little bit more immediate, I'm happy to digress.
I just have a question.
Sure thing.
In the previous slide, you mentioned about the supervised. Is that what you say?
Yes.
Because I know that one of the things that right now is doing supervised versus unsupervised learning. Were you going to talk about that later on? But we notice here is by training, right? Is that what you mean with supervising?
Yeah, so everything after this point will be unsupervised. So this is kind of the contrast. And so supervised means that using the pre-labeled database of species is, so you show this algorithm. It doesn't have to be a neural net. There are a number of supervised machine learning algorithms. You show it a bunch of examples of each type of fish. And then once it sees a new one, it makes some choice about which of the examples it's already seen is it closest to, in some sense.
Good.
Yeah, but I'm gonna move a little bit away from that into the unsupervised realm, and talk about finding shape and something like parameter estimation, where you're finding some unknown quantity, but you don't really have. Or you can also think of unsupervised as only having positive examples rather than positive and negative, if you like that way of thinking of binary classification.
Yeah, thanks.
Some sense. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so where does this? So where do we get into this geometry and high dimensional whatever? Now there's a very familiar and painful concept in applied math and math in general and statistics called the curse of dimensionality. And what this means, or what this alludes to, is the fact that as your dimension increases, the volume of a solid object, if you keep so if you have a rectangle in 2 dimensions, and then you keep the same side length in 3 dimensions, and then 4 dimensions, and then 5 dimensions, the volume of this thing is going to increase exponentially. So if you have any algorithm that needs to search a space for a correct value, the possible things that it has to rule out grow exponentially. And as we know, we would like algorithms that do not take exponential time to complete. Or in machine learning, as we'll see, or I'll mention, we don't want to need an exponential number of samples to get a correct estimation. You know, we want to be able to get an estimation with less than exponential. Let's see. So 3 that I'll talk about specifically, and I'm happy to kind of, you know, digress and do whatever as we move along. But 3 that I have prepared is, so the simplex learning problem, the parameter estimation of Gaussian mixtures, and some shape analysis. And these each have some surprising applications in engineering and natural sciences. So but the model that I want to talk about, this is how one might formalize this idea of how good is my machine learning algorithm, right? Because in a mathematical sense, not purely, not just we ran this a few times and it seemed to work okay, right? How do you prove that a machine learning algorithm gets you something usable every time? Or if you satisfy some requirements, it will give you a good enough approximation. Well, so the model that I'm going to work in for the rest of the talk is called the probably approximately correct learning model. Okay, and this is a model introduced by Leslie Valiant in a paper in 1984. There's a citation at the end if you want to go and find that. It's a pretty good read, actually, and as you would expect. But so just to break it down, right, probably is going to allude to the fact that we want something to happen with high probability, and the thing, right, the event in probabilistic terms, the event we want to happen is that our answer produced by our algorithm is approximately correct, is approximately the thing we want. Okay, so going back to the fish, I should have copy pasted, but this outline is approximately a fish. Yeah, plus or minus a couple hundred pixels, I think. Yeah. But we want to be sure that happens most of the time. So for instance, this, right, or I mean any of these, this is not a fish. Yeah, this is a piece of algae or coral or just dirt, right? So this is very much not a fish. It's not even approximately a fish. And we want errors like this to happen with low frequency. So that's where, I mean, this sounds kind of gibberish at first glance, probably approximately correct. Like, are you actually saying anything there? But no, it's we're combining this idea of estimation. So you're writing algorithms that give you an estimate of something, and you want that estimate to be pretty close to the right answer most of the time. Okay, so to say it formally is that an algorithm A, this is another way to say is a PAC learning algorithm. This is going to disappear, so I'll hold that there for a second. So algorithm A is a PAC learning algorithm if it produces an estimate X of some unknown quantity, like the true version. So it estimates this true version so that their difference is very low with very high probability. So delta would be something like 0.5 or 0.05. So that with probability at least 95%, you have X minus X hat is less than 0.01 or whatever your tolerance of error is. So you set some sort of small epsilon and some sort of small delta. And this says with high probability, our estimate X hat is going to be pretty close to the true value we want. Okay. Cool.
I have a comment here because
Yeah.
I think that was very well explained. Having read it so well explained, because the PAC basically at this point, epsilon that E that you say is your error that you want to reduce. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
So here we want to reduce the most as possible of the error in order to make it highest. The next question probably we're going to discuss when you have a lot of errors, what you usually do, but that's you probably discard it according to the PAC. Is that correct? Or you never consider them into a possibility?
It depends on if you have the ability to check your correctness somehow. If you don't have a way to, because sometimes you'll just get an answer and you don't really know if it's correct or not. But if you want to be sure, right, you can always, there's a technique called boosting you can do. If your probability is not super high, like maybe 70% or something, just run it 100 times.
Okay.
And the probability you get it wrong every single time. And maybe there's a way to figure out which of those 100 runs is closer. So there are some very sophisticated techniques to boost things if you're not sure. But
Yeah,
yeah,
thank you. Yeah.
cool. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, you want both of these parameters to be small. Yeah. But you're going to pay a price. You usually pay a price in the running time in terms of something like 1 over epsilon or 1 over delta, right? So if epsilon is 0.1, you might have to pay a price of 10 in your big O somewhere.
So this is the sacrifice that at some point nothing is for free. At least have to
Right.
consider that thing. If you want to
Smaller
have,
epsilon is more runtime or more samples. Yeah.
then you have it.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks.
We'll see that explicitly in a couple slides, I think.
All right.
Cool. So the first problem is trivially geometric. So I want to talk about something called a simplex. If you haven't heard the term simplex, it's a triangle. Okay? So it's a generalization of the idea of a triangle, but in any dimension you want. So you can define a standard simplex as the convex hull of the canonical vectors, right? Canonical vectors being E1, E2, E3, up to ED, right, from your linear algebra class, right, where, let me fade that away, and where EI is zeros, you have a 1 in the ith position. Yeah. So your ith canonical vector, you take the convex hull of all of these and with the origin, and you get a triangle, right? In 2D, you have the origin, you have 0, 1, or 1, 0, and 0, 1. And so this guy here is your standard simplex. Okay. And so, right, why do we care about the standard simplex? Is that, so these shapes appear in a lot of natural places. So for instance, oh, there's a stray, delete that from your mind. So in biology, you can observe features like you can observe genes or chemical compositions in the wild that tend to appear as convex combinations of some set of kind of constituent genes. And you want to know what are the constituent genes, or what parameters make up those constituent genes, and you can view that, you can model them as a simplex. So if you have three parent organisms, you don't know what those organisms are, but what you observe is several of their descendants or something, where each of these is some the convex combination of these 3 elements. So geometrically, they're a convex combination. You want to know what are the constituent, right? The extremes. What are the extremes? Of course, in graphics programming, you might see samples of a simplicial form, but not know where the corners actually are. So you might need to estimate where those corners are. And in statistics of modeling, there's an important distribution, right, probability distribution called the Dirichlet distribution that looks like a simplex in certain cases. And if you want to do parameter estimation on this thing, you can use simplicial, what we're going to call simplicial learning to do some parameter estimation there. So let's say I give you some samples, right? Some examples of points inside a simplex. So there's I'll do some actual drawing here. No promises. So let's say there's a simplex hiding in space here. And all I give your program is a few of these. Now you need to write a computer program that takes these as 2D coordinates and spits out numbers. Oh no, red's a poor choice. Oh no, if you're a red or green color line, I apologize. So I want your program needs to output something fairly close to these 3 coordinates, right? That's sort of the objective, right? The green is your input. The blue is your goal. Okay. Maybe I'll do some arrows just in case the color's not coming through. Okay. Right, so, and where the red dotted lines are, right, the convex hull of these 3 blue points. All right, so how can we approach this, and what the heck does this have to do with anything? So what we want to consider any of this, so any standard simplex, right? So we have these 3 points. They get transformed, right, by some a times the simplex by a linear unknown invertible linear transformation. So this is some matrix. So multiply by an invertible matrix, A. And you might end up with this guy here. So this is this same points, but I multiply them all by a matrix that I'm not going to tell you what it is. Okay. And what you want to tell me is, okay, well, what are these three points right here? Okay. And so, right, this would give you the answer about, you know, what three extreme chemicals or you know, elements of the gene pool contribute to this population of descendants, or if, you know, the Dirichlet distribution relates to topic modeling. If you have a bunch of documents that have various degrees of three different topics, you want to sort of see what are the extreme versions of each of those three topics in your document corpus. Okay. So we're not going to do anything geometric here. We're going to, in fact, use a tool called independent component analysis, which comes from the 80s in the signal processing, right? The engineering community was working on this well before this became a problem in machine learning. And so the model they take is that some engineers in the 70s, 80s were recording all this audio, and they were just asking each other, if I record a bunch of people standing around in a room, how do I separate their voices from one another? Okay, so our model, to put it formally, is we're going to have a vector, a random vector S, so it's an n vector, and a random invertible, or well, not a random, but a fixed but hidden invertible matrix A. And so what we actually observe is this linear transformation of the signal S. So already you might be thinking, oh, you said linear transformation here. You also said linear transformation here. Correct. That's going to play a big role. But maybe let me talk a second more about this model. So if the way I explained it the first time didn't quite sink in, you can imagine this as what they call the cocktail party problem. You have n people in a room, and you have n microphones in that room. All the people just start talking, and you get all these sound waves back out. And what you want to do is separate each voice into its own track. So just as a kind of toy example, right, you could take like a sine wave like this and a sawtooth wave like this, multiply them, right, do A times them, and where A is some invertible 2 by 2, right? And you might get a signal like this. So what your microphone actually picks up are these two kind of nasty cross-polluted audio signals. And what you want to do, you want to go back from this, back to these nice two clean independent signals. Okay. So that another important assumption is that each constituent signal of this random vector is mutually independent of the other. Okay, so these two waves are mutually independent. Okay. All right, so one place that ICA this problem comes up, right? Wire engineer, so obviously audio recording is pretty cool, but this model extends to some pretty interesting stuff. So for instance, these folks took some brain signal data, some MEG data, magnetoencephalograph. So basically 200 sensors just positioned around your head that watch the electricity moving around in your brain. And so you get all these mixed up things. And I mean, there are clearly some significant changes that go on, but nothing really looks independent. So in this example, they had some subjects doing some blinking. This is where the subjects were blinking. This is where the subjects were clenching their jaw, like biting down on their jaw. This is the people moving their eyes back and forth. So you could watch this thing called a saccade, which is some horizontal eye movement. And I think they just stuck a digital watch inside the MEG to kind of throw it off. Just have a constant electrical impulse, just kind of screwing around with stuff. And then there's this is kind of like a ground truth to look at. You can see the subject's heart rate, and they're measuring some vertical and horizontal eye movement. So these are electroculograms. measuring the up down eye movement and left right eye movement. So you can see them moving their eyes left and right there, and see them blinking right. This is just regular blinking. And so what they did, they feed this thing into a ICA algorithm, and what they observed is these independent components. And it's startling how well it pulls apart each of these independent brain actions. So you have the jaw beginning to clench and then probably relaxing a little, and then some noise from the continual clenching there. You can see some eye movement that's completely isolated from any other thought, right? You can see the signal induced by this horizontal eye movement. We've got the heart rate right here. We've got the blinking right here. Oh, you know, this probably is not the heart rate, right? So this is 10 seconds. 1, 2, 3. One of these is the watch, and I forget which one. This one down here might be the watch. You know, but if you look in the 10-second scale zone, you'll see 10 little ticks. So one of these is heart rate, one of them is watch. So you got blinking, you got the which one was that? That was probably these eye movements here. Yeah, so you got these eye movements. And then IC9 actually turned out to be a faulty sensor they didn't know about. So yeah, they detected a faulty sensor just by separating out these things. So this guy's just in there throwing noise into the MEG. So ICA is kind of an interesting problem in and of itself, right? Just as an engineering problem. But so how can we apply this to such a nice clean geometric problem as finding the vertices of a simplex? Well, as we already pointed out, you have this invertible linear transformation. So we're kind of looking at over here, you kind of have your input is some unknown A times your original simplex, right? Where this is our, oh, that looks like A. Make sure my triangles do not look like A's. There we go. That still looks like an A, but I'm gonna go with it. Fine. So here's the original simplex, and here's what your algorithm gets. A matrix A times your original data, and you need to figure out what this thing is. So how we can recover this, did I say right here? Right. So the problem with this is if you look at this data statistically, there's no independence here, right? If I tell you how far to the right a single point is, you know automatically how far up or down it can or can't be, right? Because it's a triangle. If I tell you the x coordinate is 0.9, you say, well, the y coordinate can't be more than 0.1, okay? Because all the points have to sum to less than 1. But it turns out we can do something a little bit crazy. And this thing that's a little bit crazy, if I multiply every one of these points by a random scalar, okay, just by a random number, I'm going to stretch each one of these points by a random amount. And that random amount is given by the gamma distribution. And in general, if you're in dimension D, you use gamma of D plus 1, comma 1. So 2 parameters of the gamma distribution. We don't need to care too much about what the gamma distribution looks like right now. What you'll get is some data like this. And what the deal is now is that right, there's independence in the x and y coordinates in this image. If I tell you a point has x coordinate 3, it's equally likely to be at y coordinate 4 as if I told you the point has x coordinate 1. Okay, there's actually independence in the x and y coordinates now. And so this was probably the first lemma I ever proved as a grad student, is that if you have random variable x uniform in the standard dimension D simplex, well, my writing as a 22-year-old was not great, I guess.
Well, that's fine. So there was a dependency. This is what I showed. This is impressive because now that means that there is something, because we didn't know the A. Is that correct? So I still have this question, why unknown A? And I think this is one of the questions I received. What is the unknown A?
Why unknown?
That is correct.
Because, so the A, so for instance, maybe if we think about Yeah, it's mostly easy to think about the geometric version. So if you think these are the standard vectors.
Those are the standard vectors, correct? And then
So
that
if you
formula.
multiply this thing by a matrix A, this coordinate will be one column of A, and this coordinate will be the other column of A. Because what actually happened here is you map this vertex of the triangle got mapped to this point by the A, and this coordinate got mapped to this point by the A.
It's a mapping. Okay, this is one of the questions that we have. It's a mapping of this transformation. And
Yes.
you can visualize that like a rows and columns, as Dr. Anderson just mentioned. Very good.
And it's unknown. It's unknown because this triangle can appear anywhere in space, and we want to know where.
Correct.
Yeah,
and this is where
we want to know the exact locations of the vertices.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. But we know it came from this one, but it got blasted out into space somewhere, and we want to basically be able to undo that transformation.
Yes.
You can also think of finding A is enough to reverse the process, right? You multiply by A inverse and you get back home to the standard one. So you can kind of recover everything.
So for those who are taking linear algebra, this is pretty much the application of the whole matrix linear algebra course that you've just been taking. I mean, this is exactly the vivid example of that. Yeah, thanks.
Yes. I would say linear algebra was my most underappreciated class as an undergrad. I was like, why do I care about the kernel space? Well, now I care about it. And the eigenvalues, right?
Yep.
It's all about eigenvalues eventually. So, okay, good. Yeah, thanks for that question.
So here is what we got after this result. So this is the proving of the lemma that we're just trying to get there. Cool. Yeah.
I left off some words here. This should say, the coordinates of t times x are independent. Not only did I copy paste bad grammar, but I didn't copy paste the whole lemma. So what's interesting is that it sounds insane, right? You're randomly scaling each one of these points. You're just saying, all right, well, now I'm going to stretch you in a random direction. Just grab each point and stretch it in a random direction, and now they're independent in each coordinate. And this gives us a model, right? So now t times x is going to give us a model that we can take this thing, scale it by this gamma distribution. So now each one of these points got scaled randomly, and we ended up with this weird stretched out cone, right? It's kind of like some of them got kind of squeezed in toward the inside. Some of them got kind of pulled out. But now if you feed this directly into an ICA algorithm, right, specifically, so for this example, I used MATLAB. MATLAB, it's called the Fast ICA, and you can download that just as a script. So I gave this data directly to the Fast ICA algorithm, and what it recovered as the columns of the transformation A were this rectangle, and this rectangle, which is pretty good. This is only a couple hundred samples, maybe.
Yeah. So this is all that they got recovered.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty impressive.
Yeah. So and if you try, I did not do this, but I should have tried giving this directly to ICA, and you don't get anything close to the right, you don't get anything close to the right answer if you skip this step and you try going directly to here. It doesn't happen because you lose that independence, and ICA hinges on that aspect of independence. So, the script is maybe 30 lines long if you download the Fast ICA algorithm as a library. So this is pretty neat, and I mean, it's fun. It's fun when you're, a young grad student, you prove something that seems kind of insane, and then you're able to actually make a relatively smart computer program out of it. Okay, so this is our first, what we'll call an algorithmic reduction. So we're reducing the simplex problem to ICA, meaning if you have an algorithm for ICA, you have an algorithm to solve the simplex. And I don't care which ICA algorithm you use here. If it solves ICA, it solves the simplex problem if you pre-process the data like this. And the final theorem says something like, if we get at least this many samples, a polynomial in the dimension, the error, 1 over the error and 1 over the failure rate, right? Let me write that down. So epsilon is what we call the error, and delta is what we might call the failure rate, right? How probable is it that your error is too big? Yeah. So if we give it enough samples, the error will be less than epsilon with probability at least 1 minus delta, which is exactly the PAC, follows the PAC format for a PAC learning algorithm. So
Model.
to say a little more colloquially, we can learn a simplex, we can PAC learn a simplex with a polynomial number of samples, not an exponential number. Yeah, go ahead.
So I think something that is very important here for those who don't know, the word polynomial in computing means a lot. And he compared it related with exponential, because this is the complexity time, how we're going to measure if a computer can solve it in a decent amount of time or it will not solve it, for example. And he mentioned about if it's a PAC model, you're solving something called simplex problem, which is something that is important to recognize that is solvable in polynomial time. Am I getting that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and I mean we're not specific about the polynomial here because it also, so the specific form of this polynomial depends on the ICA algorithm.
Right.
Yeah. So if you have a provably efficient ICA algorithm, you get a provably efficient simplex algorithm for free by using this chain of reasoning. Okay. So for instance, this might take a form of something like, you know, there are pretty bad ICA algorithms out there, but it might take the form of like d square times 1 over epsilon square plus d times d over delta. This is an example of a polynomial in d 1 over epsilon 1 over delta, because there's a 1 over delta right here. There's a d here, a d square here, a 1 over epsilon square here. Yeah.
So
Cool.
those are parametric parts, yeah.
Yeah. So this would be an example. This isn't necessarily one that I have off the top of my head, but usually you end up proving, usually your proof ends up with this somewhere in there, and you say, I don't care what this actually is, I care that it's a polynomial.
Right, yeah, that's most of the cases we have it, but I agree how you reduce that thing. If it's an ICA algorithm, you're basically working with the same boundaries per se.
Right, yeah. So the faster your ICA algorithm is, the faster this gets.
It makes sense.
Or the fewer samples you need, rather. Cool. All right. So now's your chance to stop me before we go on to the next ICA reduction. So if you think this is a fluke, it's not.
Very nice explanation.
So this one, we won't spend too much longer on this, but the same sort of mentality is going to apply though. So let's say the samples I give you aren't nicely constrained within a simplex now. I give you samples that come from one of 3 Gaussian distributions, and Gaussian is also called the normal distribution, normal distribution. I never call it that, but yeah. So I mean, it's a bell curve. So the picture I have here is that you have these 2-dimensional bell curve looking things. So this one's kind of if I were to draw a bell, the top of the bell would be right here, and the bell would kind of circle out there. This one would be an elongated kind of elliptical bell, right? So we're kind of looking at a top-down view of these bells through some samples. So I give you some samples from these things. I don't tell you which sample is from which. I don't tell you anything except here are the samples. And I'll tell you that there are 3 Gaussians, maybe. Now, what we can do is this gets even weirder. But let's think about an easy example. So let's say in 2 dimensions you have 2 Gaussians. So we're just setting everything the same right now. You have 2 Gaussians in 2 dimensions. Switch back to red. If we, and here comes the weird randomness again. If we draw a random number of samples, so we ask whoever is providing samples for a random number of them, and we just start adding them together. So if I draw 2 from here and 1 from here, that's going to give me a point, 1, 2, 1. That's going to give me a point right here. You're just using vector addition, right? So your tip to tail rule. If I get 2 points from this cluster and 1 point from this cluster and add them together with vector addition, right? So I'm going to get 1, and then it's going to force me to go over again and then up 1 more, roughly, right? There's going to be some wiggle room in there. But if you do this over and over, so I'm gonna grab, so specifically if you like stats and you like distributions, the random number here is the Poisson distribution. So I'm going to grab a Poisson number of, right, which goes back to the fish detection. Not really.
Because Poisson is in French fish. That's an interesting joke.
Yeah, interesting coincidence. But so you draw a Poisson number of samples of each of these and just add them together. What you're going to get is this goofy looking grid. Okay, and in this goofy looking grid, you start to see something like statistical independence. You start to kind of see these rectangular areas clustering toward the origin. And so we have to do a lot of, we have to do a little bit of hacking here. And what we do is we decide where to cut this thing off. And then we only consider the bottom left rectangle of it. So you get, this introduces more error into the process. So we need to draw more samples to compensate for this. But once we cut off this thing at a threshold, we're able to see some statistical independence here. And so if I give these samples to ICA in high enough dimension, these corners will actually just go away because they become with so low probability. We give this to an ICA algorithm. We give this to an ICA algorithm and it will recover the transformation, which is the centers of these Gaussians. That's the full story there. I don't want to, this one gets a little bit hairy if I go into more detail, but
that's a great story actually. That's very well.
It's weird. So if I give this data to, well, I have to give all this data to ICA. So these little bits are going to give you some error, but you just draw more samples and be all right. It will recover, right? ICA will report back to you where the centers of each Gaussian were. And this is, of course, with there's no transformation in the picture here, just to keep things nice and clean. Okay, so, but if you multiply all the situation by an A, ICA will report back the columns of that A, which is pretty crazy. And this one, right, if you Google Gaussian mixture model, there are tons and tons of real world applications of it. I think the first one on record is, I forget who, but they're a biologist measuring crabs in the Mediterranean. And what they measured was the proportion of the length of the crab to the width of the crab. And what they ended up seeing was a mixture. There were multiple populations of crabs, but you can't tell them apart by plain sight because the person's not a marine biologist. They're a statistician measuring crabs. And so what they saw was this Gaussian mixture type behavior. They started seeing a picture that looked like this, and now they want to know what are these, right? What are these centers, right? What are the parameters of these Gaussian mixture, of these Gaussians inside the mixture? So this is one way that you can solve that problem. This has been approached by many researchers in the last 20 or 30 years. This problem is very important, but it's 100 years old or more. And it's not, I don't want to say it's completely solved in a satisfactory way, because there are still a lot of assumptions. Even in our algorithm, we're assuming that each Gaussian has the same covariance, and you know the number of Gaussians beforehand. So you kind of have to know some information, but that's research. You're chipping off a little bit at a time. So, but this was a very surprising reduction to ICA, partially because of this crazy Poisson process, right? You draw some Poisson number, and the Poisson numbers tend to go to cluster in this rectangular region. And then, well, you can just sort of forget about all the other ones and give this to ICA and then just compensate for the error inside the algorithm, which is kind of neat. So this is a much less trivial reduction, but a much richer one, I think. Comments? Questions? Good.
I think we're fine. I think I just found amazing that this information was sitting there for, I mean, the study, right? For the scientists, for this marine scientists for many years. And then now you say like, this makes a lot of sense with these distributions. And it was not until later on that actually trying to apply it in a real world situation. I also found very interesting, Joe, that how the connection of signal processing that you mentioned previously makes a lot of sense now when you try to do this transformation. Collaborations and of course multidisciplinary work that they were doing in a completely different sense makes sense at some point when you put it together in one main objective. I just found it amazing, this part.
Knowledge transfer is an amazing and amazingly slow process.
It is indeed slow per se. Yes. I think we're fine at this point. Yeah. If you have any questions, please just let me know through the chat. I think I'm consolidating a couple more because I think I know where you're going. So I'll talk about that later.
Okay, good. So just to, I still see I don't believe this number. Just double checking. This is lying. I think I pasted the thing twice in here. Good. Whew. I was hoping I didn't have 70 slides. That would scare me. I've never done a 70 slide presentation. Okay. So we've been dancing around this thing called ICA. And this is, am I about to lie to you? No, I'm not. Okay. This follows the chronology of my work, actually. So I did all this thing. I didn't care how ICA worked, right? I don't give a dang how ICA works. I was like, ICA can do all this fun stuff. I don't care. But then you start thinking about these problems, and we started running to these statistical distributions where ICA just fails, right? Just naturally, even if you have independence, even if you have this invertible transformation, there's these implicit assumptions on ICA because most ICA algorithms need to compute things like the mean of the data, the covariance of the data, and does a process called moment chasing or method of moments, depending on who you talk to. But the disappointing part of that is not every statistical distribution even has an average, right? That's an obnoxious claim to make, right? Right. It's a weird thing, and the I guess most pathological, well, one of the most pathological examples is called the Cauchy distribution, right? And so I've plotted it here. Oh, I should have included some other plots, but it's okay. So the Cauchy distribution looks a heck of a lot like the Gaussian distribution. Yeah, well, obviously my sketch didn't. But it's called heavy-tailed, right? It's what we call a heavy-tailed distribution because these tails, it decays much, much more slowly than the Gaussian distribution. And if you try to calculate the expectation or the mean of this orange curve, it doesn't exist. Okay, what you get is if you try to calculate the expectation of a Cauchy, you're going to get an infinity minus infinity integral. So, and there's nothing we can do about it. Just the way the PDF is defined is roughly 1 over x squared. So good luck.
Oh wow! So
from minus infinity to infinity.
Good luck on that. So it's because it's the heavy part on the tails. Is that what makes the mean inexistent? Or just that
you're integrating 1 over x from minus infinity to infinity,
which doesn't exist.
Yeah. So everybody's said. But what this means, right, in terms of ICA, any ICA algorithm that uses the mean and the covariance, if I gave you signals, right, if I have signals that are distributed according to the Cauchy distribution, ICA is going to give you nonsensical answers because it tries to compute a mean where the mean doesn't exist. And if I, at some point soon, end up switching over to the desktop, I can show you some more interesting plots about that. And I'm just going to go through this slide very, very quickly, but just to illustrate what I mean, why we need the mean and higher moments, is that one kind of standard approach to ICA, this is how fast ICA works, the algorithm I mentioned before. So this is the input to your algorithm if my original distribution is just uniform inside a rectangle. So this trivially satisfies my assumptions of ICA. you have coordinate-wise independence, right? If I tell you where the X is, you don't know where the Y is, statistically speaking. And A is going to be invertible, right? So we can see that this A is going to be invertible. And so the first step of ICA is to transform this stretched out, messed up data into something rectangular, or it's trying to separate these important directions. But what you end up with is the original data, but rotated in this case, right? More complicated pictures are not going to be so obvious, but in this case, you've kind of half solved the problem just by doing this what we'll call the whitening step, because it goes from sort of biased in some directions, but now it's sort of not biased anymore, but it's still, yeah, it still has some weirdness to it. But then what we do is we use this thing called the fourth moment, which is roughly speaking, fourth moment is the expectation. If you're taking the mean, the mean of the fourth power of your random variable is close to the fourth moment, if you haven't seen that. So this is like, you're looking at the data in this direction. Look how far it is along this line, and then calculate its average when you take it to the fourth power. And so this black curve here is important because this is tracing out how the fourth moment behaves, right? So the fourth moment in this direction is a lot more than the fourth moment in this direction. And then it comes up and it peaks again, and then it troughs, and then peaks, and then valleys, and then peaks, and then valleys. And it turns out, right, one of the tenets of ICA is that you can minimize or maximize the fourth moment to find the directions of independence. And that allows you to unrotate this rectangle and get back the original data, or at least the shape of the original data. Okay, so I don't want to worry too much about those details, but this is where specifically, right? So you need the center of the data, and you need to use the covariance to do this whitening. And then you need the fourth moment to perform this rotation. So we looked at this and we said, well, not every, right, if the Cauchy distribution doesn't have a mean, it doesn't have a covariance. Okay. As soon as you don't have a mean, you don't have any other moments. The integrals all blow up to infinity and they don't exist. They all diverge, rather. So we're able to actually replace the usage of covariance completely in ICA by using this object called the centroid body. And so I've plotted some data here. This is Cauchy data. No, this can't be Cauchy data. That would be crazy. No, I'm not sure what this is. Probably just Gaussian data. Yeah, this looks. Yeah,
heavy part is there, yeah, in the middle.
So yeah, the covariance, the standard covariance ellipse is this blue thing, but we're going to replace it, morally speaking, with this red thing inside. And what we prove is that using this red shape to orthogonalize the data lets you perform the same whitening step as with ICA, but the covariance, the way it's defined, only depends on the mean, not the variance. Okay, so it's only a first order calculation. So we can do this if the data has at least a mean. And so we can swap this out, and here's some other examples of the centroid body. So if you're looking at the centroid body of a rectangle, it's kind of this rounded rectangle, this rounded diamond. The centroid body of this rectangle is like this egg shape in the middle. But the conclusion of this is that we can solve ICA approximately with high probability, probably approximately, when the coordinates of S have at least 1 plus epsilon moments. So not quite Cauchy. Cauchy is still out because it doesn't have any moments. But if it's, say, a low power law or a low power Pareto distribution type of a thing, we can solve ICA where before ICA would have just given us garbage data. Okay. And the main idea there is that we replace this whole whitening step with a covariance, and then we can perform some outlier rejection that I have a picture of later if there's time, to sort of smartly ignore the things that are dragging the quantities away. So this is an interesting change, right? So this is the other side of the coin of the first two problems, is that we looked at ways to use ICA in ways that it's not supposed to be used and solve problems that it was never supposed to solve. And now we're saying, well, ICA can actually solve more in the domain that it was made for than was realized before when they invented it. And we just do that by swapping out some of the stages of ICA with alternative data structures or computations. Okay, so instead of computing the mean, or instead of computing the covariance, what we compute is the matrix describing the axes of this centroid body. Because you can think of the covariance matrix as the axes of this covariance ellipse. But we instead use the axis of this centroid ellipse. Okay, so you're using the same type of object, but it comes from a different place, and it mirrors the effect of the old technique. And we this last year have improved this recently, so we can finally do it for Cauchy. So we finally proved that we can approximately solve ICA when you have Cauchy data. And we're using this goofy thing called the floating body, which is kind of fun to describe. It's if you imagine dipping this thing in water and rotating, letting it float around, and if you rotate it, which parts of this rectangle are never going to sink below the surface? So it's, for the rectangle, it's going to be kind of like this. It's kind of like an inner version, but it's a way of generalizing the idea of a median. Oh, where did that go? Next slide. So you can think of medians are a very robust statistical tool that have been of a lot of interest in the last couple of years, and well before that, of course, but a lot of machine learning, because they're so robust. You have to corrupt half of your data before you can corrupt to the median. Where with a mean, if you have a whole bunch of just a, kind of show you what I mean. That was not supposed to be a pun, but it is now. So if I give you these points, the mean is somewhere, I don't know where exactly, but it's somewhere in here. But if I corrupt one of these things and I add a point way over here, which is actually very common in Cauchy when you're sampling from the Cauchy distribution, the mean can get dragged, way over this way. Right, so if I push this thing way far out, you can drag with only one point, corrupting only one point, you can drag the mean arbitrarily far from the rest of the data. Yeah, this is like when you look at financial data, you have to be careful, or you're talking about mean or median, right? The mean income is going to be a lot different than the median income.
Very
because
different.
Of Jeff Bezos.
Very different,
or the
yes.
net worth, maybe. I don't know about income, but net worth for sure. So this is the idea that kind of inspires the floating body, is that we want to use we want to replace these moments with medians, or these robust concepts like a median. And then, of course, inside there's some interesting convex geometry going on that I'm not going to talk about. So, but if you're interested in like linear programming and solving optimization problems, that plays a huge role in this heavy tail ICA solution. So that's kind of where I want to leave it with these two main conclusions, is that ICA is what we regard as an algorithmic primitive. And it's not just statistical, it's a geometric thing where it's able to translate or map statistical constraints onto geometric constraints. So where we see that ICA depends on independence, well, we say, well, any or a lot of different product distributions can apply to this. And the simplex was the prime example of that, right? What you have here statistically is a product distribution. Yeah. Or a sort of product distribution, almost, until you do this, and then it really is a product distribution. because you have independence. So achieving our statistical independence is done by this weird geometric trick, and then we can, instead of talking about covariance, well, we forget about the fact that covariance is the statistical way to look at bias, or one statistical way to look at bias, but we replace it with this other purely geometric, well, almost purely geometric concept called the centroid body. And we look at the ellipse formed by that instead of the covariance, because it's very closely related. But they come from completely different places. And ICA has been our favorite way to link, right, to make this mapping really apparent. And so I guess my open question to you is, what else can ICA do? Right? If you look at any sort of estimation problem or statistical learning problem, say, can I write it? Can I write this as x equals a times s? If you can, then the answer might be yes. If you hack it a little bit, you know, to achieve the rest of the assumptions. So, and I mean, if you're in linear algebra, this is probably the most right. This is one of the first things you learn, right? How to solve a equals x times b, or something like that, something similar. Right? Linear systems, right? Linear systems is one of the first things you learn in linear algebra. So we're still milking it. Cool. So thank you.
That's impressive. Thank you so much. And I have a couple questions here that I've been asked, and please feel free to tell me, send me something through the chat so I can ask. One of the things that you were talking about was this relationship in linear algebra. Many people might think, I agree with you. I think it was one of the very underestimated courses that probably I took when I was in undergrad. But now that you can see all these linear systems that you have to process comes directly from linear systems. Linear algebra, MATLAB is basically that the whole libraries that you work on that is just system of equations, linear equations. Going back to your example of the fish, when you have all that information coming from there, I guess that whole point of extracting information and collecting that information, get the characteristics and everything, you put them on I guess it's a system of linear equations, because there's different polynomials, different components of that. When you put it in practice, and this is what you start learning, because one of the questions that I have, how this relates with artificial intelligence and machine learning. All this information that you obtain, for example, in the example of NOAA, right? They have a big database of, I don't know, thousands and thousands of gigabytes. I'm not so sure of gigabytes, but it's a lot of gigabytes of information in NOAA, right?
Yeah.
That they've been taking pictures, a lot of pictures there, and then that's how you start to recognize. That is called a data set, and this is one of the questions: how is that related? So if you can elaborate a little bit more, how is that related? I mean, into the linear questions, you put everything, and I think you mentioned that every pixel represents something. And when you say the borderline between one image and another image, that's what catch your attention. And I think that's where you can have it, that in a matrix. Is that what I'm understanding correctly, Joe?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And a lot of image processing algorithms will I feel like I need a new page for this. I want to draw a picture. I can just use this one. So a big part of image processing actually is, you can do a matrix if you build yourself like say a 3x3 matrix. One image process, you call this an image processing person would call this filtering, a way of filtering. So you would take the top 3x3 pixels, do the matrix multiplication, and store that data back in one of these pixels. So that gives you a number. And then depending on what this matrix is, you can do some really rich things to this image. So this is how blurring works, sharpening works, edge detection works. You pass these filters, which are really just you loop a matrix multiplication, and it'll be something like, some kind of trivial matrix like this that kind of zeroes out some pixels and negates others and shifts things around in interesting ways. And it's usually symmetric and kind of nice looking. But this is how filtering works. And this is one way some of these algorithms work to gather up data about nearby pixels, right? So if you have this kind of matrix, and you matrix multiply with a chunk of matrix, with a chunk of pixels here, well, it's going to say, well, it's going to look at the middle row, because this column is a 1, right? You do row times column. So this is going to focus the middle row, and then this one is going to focus the top and bottom row, but remove the middle row. And then you're going to focus the middle row again and add all these things together. So these are some kind of odd ways to combine and condense pixel data that result in some strange things.
Yeah, and I think it's very nice that you work with this particular data with a big corporation, that they provide you that information. It's a national lab.
Yeah,
that
yeah.
You cannot have that or you cannot just make that data. I mean, it has to come from real data in order to understand how the distributions. Talking about the distributions, it seems to be that statistics is the language of machine learning.
Absolutely.
I mean, everything that you've been talking about deals with statistics, of course. Systems of linear equations, but most of them, if you already recognize certain statistics patterns or distributions, or if it's something related with the covariance or whatnot, you can actually apply it directly to these models and say you can just reduce a lot of things, which is most of the work that you do. You reduce a problem. It's like, oh, I like the way that you use, this is a trick. I mean, this is a trick that we can use. It's a hack, right? So in computers, in computer programming, always just make a simple hack in order to make this loop work or not. It's the same situation with statistics. I mean, you can see a problem and you can say, we can solve it with this tool. It's a hack. We can solve it by using any reduction with ICA algorithms or whatnot. And it's very impressive how the statistics make now the application. Am I going to the right direction here? And it makes a lot of sense when you were talking about the data sciences and whatnot. I mean, you can just apply everything with those statistical models.
Yes, statistics is the language of uncertainty. And, you know, as mathematicians, we're possibly the most uncertain people on the planet.
Which I agree. And statistics, basically, that's how you probably, when you talk about uncertainty, this is the way you can predict things, because if you already have data and how it behaves, you have with all this information, you have this distribution. So now you can predict what's going to happen. And yes, statistics is. Maybe we can just even talk about fuzzy logic, which is a different kind of tool. How can you actually try to hit it? But of course, statistics is the way we can actually measure these predictions and how this uncertainty. We don't know what's going to happen later on, but at least we know tools like this one that can predict what's going to happen in the near future or in the, I don't know how many years, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and you start with the basics too, because when you start learning statistics, I wish I knew how I copy pasted this thing so many times. How do I make a new page here? I don't even know.
Yeah. Add page.
So when you learn, when you start your statistics, you're almost always going to learn something called Markov's inequality, right?
Correct. Markov's.
This is me trying to write on a weirdly angled surface. Right? For if you have a random variable that's always positive, the probability that x is bigger than any constant is at most its mean over that constant. Right? Did I get this right?
Yeah, I think so. That sounds like it's been a while, but yeah, the Markov's
comes with expectation on both sides. Yeah, okay.
There's the expectation is this inequality. Yeah, go ahead.
So if x is a waiting time, right? You're waiting for the train, and you want to know. So you have you have two bits of data. You have how late is the train on average. You say it's usually 5 minutes late, and you want to know, well, what's the probability that it's going to be 50 minutes late today because I got out of bed late, right? What chance do I have of making the train? Well, Markov's inequality would tell you that you have. Right, the probability that happens is at most 5/15, so 1/3. So you don't have more than a 33% chance of making the train automatically.
Yeah, it's in a nutshell. Yeah.
So I mean, it's not like I don't think a lot of my students have this hang up where, you know, you see papers where they start throwing around these crazy these crazy things like, Poisson distributions, and this paper is in particular very, very hairy statistics, the hoops you have to jump through to prove it. But you can start so fundamental with the building blocks that you learn in your intro stats class, right? Hypothesis testing isn't just something we do because we're mean. It's because it has a lot of meaning in your everyday life.
And I think that's something that we should have paid attention for in the very beginning. Now we have time to just discuss and collect that information about the expectation. I guess that's the beauty of data science these days. We can just incorporate that thing. If we have time for another question, what are the advantages of deep learning over machine learning? You might have a question that I just have that pop up questions. And what is the difference between AI and machine learning, and are both growing industries? And if it's possible,
so I can kind of answer these two in a similar way. Is that I mean, this isn't, I'm obviously not the gospel here, but AI itself is composed of a lot of parts, right? So you need there's a sensory, right? There's a sensory portion of AI, right? You have sensors that pick up data and just feed, just pipeline data into your system. You have rules, right? Any AI system has to have rules. Even if you say it's a neural net, the neural net only gives you a number. The rules have to be how you interpret that number. The part where the neural net comes in, or any of these algorithms that I've talked about, is what we call ML, machine learning, right? We're talking about a specific part inside AI where you use data, right? Where you use data to make new or adjust rules, to make new rules, to make or change the rules. And then finally, I mean, kind of the after that stage is where you take action. Okay, so like moving a robot arm or making a recommendation to somebody. So I think what one would probably call AI is this full gamut, And so machine learning is a very specific part of that, where you're going to kind of adjust your representation of the world, and then the rules are going to interpret that representation of the world to take actions. And the data that fuels that process comes from the sensory part of your eye. So the full package has to be, you have to look for data in the right place, which is where your sensors come in, and then have a way to interpret and store that data and do the some sort of rule-based system, even if it's not like I don't necessarily mean like a Prolog based, you don't have to be a Prolog programmer or something like that. That's not what I mean by rules, but you have to interpret the numbers somehow. So even like your Amazon recommendation says, if the probability they're going to buy this vacuum cleaner is bigger than 90%, I should recommend it to them. That's a rule, It's as simple as an if statement.
So now that you mentioned those, for example, Amazon.com or Spotify or Pandora, like what they recommend you music, for example, or you what a product, is that an ML? Is that what you're saying? Because it's extracting that information directly?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the simplest, it's kind of the simplest example of this tool chain, because the sensory part is just gathering your history, right? It has all the songs you've listened to with all their metadata. It's already gathered. They have the rules that probably just says ask the ML thing for which one is the most likely candidate, and then just give them the top 10. Yeah. So I don't think the question of what are the advantages of deep learning over machine learning isn't quite framed the way I think you mean it, because deep learning is a type of machine learning.
It is indeed.
And it's using a neural net with a gigantic number of internal parameters. And if you want to contrast that versus something like a decision tree, or that versus something like a Bayesian classifier, or that versus a support vector machine, or one of these, I guess, more classical or I don't really have a word for the non-neural net machine learning algorithms.
Yeah, some also the traditional ways. And I think the key word that you put here is they change the rules. And I think this is something that is a constantly updating of the rules and things like that. Nothing that you mentioned, you have back in the 70s, we have Prolog, artificial intelligence. When you have all these rules, here you go, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of failed. Artificial intelligence during the 70s kind of failed because, I mean, it was not useful. Of course, we have all these novels and movies about something taking control of something according to the rules, because it was kind of scary at the very beginning, but didn't work because we have all these rules as just a machine just working according to those rules. Here we have the changing rules which you can adopt every time, and of course that involves the current space and time that you're making those decisions and how it's going to have the impact, and then learn from that. And I think that makes a lot of sense when you were having those matrices, when you transform them, and then the next iteration is already the matrix transform in the next iterations and whatnot. So I have one specific question, and I'm not so sure, this is one from one of my colleagues. Is it possible to study axiomatic structures of Euclidean geometry and related problems by using robust learning? What do you think to say about that?
I think I know what you mean, and I think the answer is probably yes. There have been examples. I don't have a citation on hand, but recently, in the last couple of years, there have been examples of machine learning folks getting derivations of Newtonian mechanics out of their learning system. They just feed in some physical data, and the system tries to describe it with an equation, and then it got close to the standard mechanical functions.
Yeah, that's pretty.
So probably a lot of the work will be how to structure how the answers come out and get interpreted.
You were talking about before about neural networks, and I'm not so sure if we have time to a full demonstration, but Dr. Anderson told me about, there was one question, what was the best process for understanding neural networks from the ground up, instead of just create everything from scratch? And I think that's a very common question when you're dealing with machine learning. You have already this decision, this structure, these models, and neural networks basically adopt them. Am I getting the right taste about this?
Mm-hmm. I think so. So let me swap over. This should be easy to do. So here's ignore my students complaining. Okay. So at some point, my students ask me this question all the time because neural networks are very attractive things because of their flexibility and the things that we see them do. We get like the robot dog. There are crazy examples of what neural nets have been shown to do, especially now with like the GPT-3. If you don't know what GPT-3 is, I highly recommend a Google, but you can see some crazy stuff. And so I wrote this code for them a while ago, and I can send this to Dr. Servin, and he can distribute it or do what he wants, because I don't think it might be on my GitHub somewhere. I don't know anymore. But so this was just me proving to my students that it's not hard. Less than 312 lines of code in Python, and I implemented a neural network, honest to goodness, from scratch. There's no, right, you see I didn't import any SciPy. There's no SciPy, there's no TensorFlow, there's no PyTorch, nothing. This really just comes from looking at the equations that define the backpropagation algorithm and writing them down as matrix multiplications. And here we go with the linear algebra again. The core of this program is the forward step of the learning, which is really just doing one matrix multiplication. And then the backpropagation step, which is this is just setting up some initialization, but then more matrix multiplications. Yeah. And then the rest of this is really just plotting and user interaction. And so what I want to do, the point of this thing, so this is a neural net that learns two classes in 2 dimensions. And you can, I wouldn't recommend changing the dimension because then the plots will get weird or impossible. but you can tune the number of hidden layers and the size of each hidden layer right here, and as well as the learning rate and any bias stuff you want to deal with. So if I see this in action, this is currently a 10 by 10 neural net. So it has 100 parameters, you could say. If I run this thing, so pull that down there, I'm going to train this 10 times, and the points that it's trying to learn from are these two blue and the red. So what we see right here is the colors. The colors are what the neural net thinks reality is, right? The neural net thinks this region is very red. It thinks this region is probably mostly red, and then it's a little bit less confident, right? It's clearly wrong, right? We see that the ground truth is that this point is blue, this point is blue, this point is red. So it's very, very wrong. But if I keep training this, if I just do one iteration, as it updates its internal parameters, we can watch the evolution of its internal belief system until finally, now my computer's starting to heat up. Hold on, I'm gonna do 100 iterations. Speed this process up. A little more. Might take a few. And this is, so if you ever wonder why people have to train neural nets for weeks, this is why. We started with a bad starting point. Let's try a few more.
I like the fact that, yes, sometimes it takes years. Well, not years, but I guess if you have the resources, yes.
Probably at this point, the smart algorithm would abort and start over. But I'm being stubborn. Hold on. Let's see if we can get there. I think we're making some progress. So now we see, so we can watch the loss evolving, and it's not really changing too much. But now at least we have one of the blues in the blue region, and the red is getting sort of close. It's at least in the ambiguous region. So if we, oh no, well, invalid. I didn't handle the input very well. No, but so I have this thing initializing itself randomly, so we can just start over. And different runs will start differently. So this one's starting in a pretty good way, and it should adjust itself around to, but this is just a way to view the flexibility, right? I mean, look how complicated this decision area is because it's a 10 by 10. And if we change the numbers of parameters, so let me get out of that. Oops, need to close. Oh boy, now it's mad. So if I reduce the number, so let's just say I do let's just do a one layer, say with 2 nodes. So this is a 2-parameter system. And let's train it on, let's just train it once. So really the only flexibility we're gonna see here is it's gonna be kind of a plain quadratic looking thing. And this is gonna train a lot faster too, because it's a lot easier to update the rules. And now I've hit a point where it's only gonna keep reinforcing itself because it's not seeing any wrong examples. So you can get a visualization of how when it gets things wrong, it's forced to change its internal representation. So right now, the internal representation is that there's a parabolic region up here, a parabolic region down here. And I'm not telling you what the ground truth is. It could be anything that adheres to these 3 dots is considered correct. So neural nets are very fragile, and somewhat disappointingly, they don't come with the guarantees of a PAC learning algorithm that says if you train it enough, it will get there, right? That's not true for neural nets, and in particular deep neural nets. You just kind of have to train it, and if it gets close, hope that it's right. There's very little theoretical guarantee with neural net, and that's one of the interesting things to observe with a software like this. But to answer the question, the best way to learn it from scratch is to program it from scratch. Yeah, and I'm obviously taking some shortcuts with arrays and stuff, but it's all numerical tricks. There's nothing magical happening here.
And I think this is a great script. This is Python, and it's something that is very popular right now. And I noticed that you don't use any specific libraries. In case you use some specific libraries, you probably can increase the performance or reduce the branching or whatnot. And it's pretty amazing. Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
It's the most naive possible implementation.
No, it's great. I think it's funny. It's funny that you were using Linux there to run your scripts.
I use Linux for everything.
For everything, me too. It's funny that you use Linux and you use and you were working with actually with fish. I have this T-shirt, right, of Linux.
I like it.
It was a weird coincidence of that, and I was just like,
That's
I know that.
perfect.
I want to thank you, Dr. Anderson. Joe, thank you so much for joining us and for giving this exciting presentation in this podcast. We're really, really happy. I think we learned a lot. And
it was great to be here. I had a good time.
Thank you for that. Thank you for my time. Thank you everybody for your questions, for attending to this session. I like to see all my colleagues here in the chat and the questions that they're sending me, the students. This is basically for you guys. So I think this is a great collaborations that we have here and great opportunities. Thank you, Joe. Thank you for coming.
Thank you all.
I'll see you next time in another episode. Take care, guys. Take care.